Hi, good evening. My name is Summer, and I am a real alcoholic and a real addict. Welcome to Spiritual Life is Not a Theory, and we are part of Big Book Compendium, our 8 p.m. Big Book study. Every night we have a different guest, and tonight I am so excited and happy to introduce Marty C. from Toronto, and he's going to be with us for our interpretation of the next couple pages in the big book. And if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself or where your home group is and anything, just a little bit. Yeah.
Summer, thanks so much, buddy. And for anybody who doesn't know, before the recording comes on, Summer does a really nice job of welcoming everybody. And I want to echo that sentiment and say thank you, everybody, for being here. It means nothing if there's no listener. I mean, it only takes one other alcoholic, but when a few people, we got 25, 30 people coming on here and expressing the sort of the love we have and the desire we have to grow in effectiveness and usefulness through this process. We're of like mind, and I am an alcoholic. I'm a member of the Prince George group in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, which is just maybe 30 miles from Toronto. But we never copped to being Torontonians. Like, we are directly in opposition. Toronto.
Oh,
If there's any other Canadians here, they know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm from Hamilton. We're a
oh.
blue collar town. We're hardcore. We're tough. And Toronto is a little different than that. There might be some Torontonians here, but that's the way it goes. And I've been a member of Alcoholics Anonymous in pretty good standing for a couple of decades, but I've been in Alcoholics Anonymous since July the 16th, 1987. Been sober since that day. And I just want to say that because I want to get into the juice here, is that the name of this meeting, "Spiritual Life is Not a Theory," is probably at the forefront of my spiritual life of recent. It's seemingly got me in a place where I'm wonderfully attached to and connected to this power, that I am understanding that this process, this technical process of recovery, is an amazing formulation to open up my heart and my mind to all kinds of adventurous things. The spiritual life is truly not a theory. But on the other hand, what I'm battling is my judgment. I battle my judgment. I know all kinds of people in Alcoholics Anonymous who lay claim to being sober members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I look at them and what goes through my head is, oh man, the spiritual life is not a theory. So I have to get out of that. I have to get out of that game where I'm using that very powerful bit of information that the spiritual life is not a theory to not sort of assess others and where they are in their recovery lives, and not separate myself from the very thing that's going to save me, which is you guys. So thanks so much for having me, Sam. And like I said at the beginning, I'm going to take your lead here. You let me know what you want from me, and away we'll go.
All right. Awesome. I'm gonna read about a paragraph or so, and then I'm gonna open it up for you, and then we'll just take turns, and it's gonna be very smooth. So no worries. Thank you for that, Marty, too. All right. So we're on page 28 on the second paragraph. We, in our turn, sought the same escape with all the desperation of drowning men. What seemed at first a flimsy reed has proved to be the loving and powerful hand of God. A new life has been given us, or if you prefer, a design for living that really works. So, like, yeah, that I mean, when I first heard, I heard it a lot in the rooms, like, yeah, the flimsy reed, it's actually God. And I've had to, talk to myself, like I have to be in a place of every day, like my step one, like I have to be desperate, as desperate as a drowning man, like I picture myself in the ocean, like trying to get air and like taking anything that would like be there and like trying to get that air. Because I mean, I don't know if anyone's had a close drown, but I drowned when I was younger. And like that need for air and like that, it's just like that's the desperation we want to have here. And like I love this line, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it, Marty.
Yeah. So we're going through this in a wonderful piecemeal fashion, and I go back to like July the 15th, 1987. On July the 15th, 1987, I had yeah, it's not 68 Savage, it's 28.
Oh.
So what happened? What happened was, uh, I was in absolute abject darkness and madness, and I had this inside that never matched my outside. It was filled with rage, hate, and anger. And on July 16th, forced to my knees with the desperation that only a drowning man would have, I was brought to my knees sober. I hadn't had a drink. I'd had lots of mind altering stuff while in prison, but I hadn't had a drink in a couple of weeks. The mind altering stuff was to keep me from dying of alcohol withdrawal. But I dropped to my knees on that day on July the 16th, 87, screamed out for help, and the help came. Now, when I look at this and I think about this, the idea of desperation, that's what I wish for people. And it doesn't have to look the same as it did for me. But what happened was when I rose to my feet and I knew that the loving hand of God had blessed me, I knew that day something powerful had happened. I have not had a drinking thought since that day. I'm not talking about an obsession. I'm talking about a drinking thought. And so that's a big part of my story. And when it talks about the flimsy reed being the hand of God, I get that. So time, there's no time in the spiritual world. 14 years later, I come to understand that what looked like a flimsy reed proved to be the hand of a loving God that carried me through 14 years of sobriety without ever being engaged in this process. What it says, what seemed at first to be the flimsy reed proved to be a loving and powerful hand of God, and a new life had been given us, if you prefer, a design for living. This design for living had not necessarily been introduced to me. But what happened was I fell into this fellowship. I fell into this sort of like-mindedness. This people were not dying of drinking and drugging. They weren't, and so I fell into their lap, and a fellowship began to grow up around me. And to be honest with you, uh, for a long, long time, I thought that was AA. And that's just my experience. And anybody who's ever heard me speak knows that that is not unusual back then in the 80s. There was not a lot of 12-step work or big book stuff going on. We were fellowshipping the hell out of one another. That's what we were doing. We're just loving on one another and fellowshipping the shit out of each other. And, that's what we were doing. And, so when I look at this and that what we just read, I think about this design for living that they've put in quotes. That's something that wasn't exposed to me or sort of I didn't see it for 14 years. But again, remember, there's no time in the spiritual world. That whatever happened, I'm 36 years sober now. Whatever happened, that's a blip. That 14 years is a blip. And what I do know is that nothing on July the 15th, nothing was going to happen for me until I became desperate enough to scream out for help. That was it. That was absolutely necessary. You're right. When you got no air, that your last breath should be, God help me, or please help me, or that's exactly what happened to me, and that help came.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That divine help. Yeah. It's hard to kind of stomach, I guess, like that we have to be desperate, hopeless. Like I never wish that upon anyone else either. I don't want them to, have to go through a bad experience, but like sometimes we have to have that pain, that desperation, that feeling of being like lost to go and seek, So it reminds me of the hopelessness that I had too, as well. And it wasn't until I was hopeless was I able to find hope. Okay, so back to the book. The distinguished American psychologist William James, in his book Varieties of Religious Experience, indicates a multitude of ways in which men have discovered God. We have no desire to convince anyone that there is only one way by which faith can be acquired. If what we have learned and felt and seen means anything at all, it means that all of us, whatever our race, creed, or color, are the children of a living creator with whom we may form a relationship. Relationship upon simple and understandable terms, as soon as we are willing and honest enough to try. Those having religious affiliations will find here nothing disturbing to their beliefs or ceremonies. There is no friction among us over such matters. What do you think, Marty? Take it away with that. I'm sure you've read that book, Varieties of a Religious Experience, or have you?
Oh, buddy, I've given it a few solid tries, and maybe when I'm 66 years sober, it'll come to mean. Yeah, to be completely honest, it's accumulated some connection for me. When I read that, I was way too early in my sobriety to try and read that book. There's an interesting thing, sort of it's a convoluted point, but I find it very interesting that uh, Carl Jung was a student of Freud's. And in 1909, Freud took Carl Jung to a talk that was being held, I think it was at Stanford University. And it was being held by this guy called William James. And William James was an established author at that time. So Carl Jung met William James, and that pulled him out of the Freudism. He began to sort of detach away from that sort of Freudist ideology around psychology and started to look more around meaning and look more around this idea of religious experience. And William James never really laid claim to any sort of dogma. He went around the world and began to see that in almost every single religious body there was this idea of transformation, some sudden transformation, a religious experience that took place. And when Ebby went to see Bill on that night in the hospital on page 13, he left religious varieties of religious experience beside his bed. And Bill chipped away at it, and I got to say, Bill must have been much more intelligent than me. And many people I've met have struggled with that book. And in long term in sobriety, still got a couple of copies here. I gave a couple away, and it was a waste of time. People said, "What is that?" But the idea here is, and I want to simplify what this paragraph is all about for us in Alcoholics Anonymous, for people who are on here who maybe are trying to get sober and maybe struggle with that second step stuff. And what it's really saying here in this paragraph is that, like Sandy Beach says, is that our job in Alcoholics Anonymous is not to convince you of the existence of a God. It's not to convince you of the God or the power to define the power. To define the power for you is not our job. Our job for you is to prove the existence of a need for God by holding up our own experience and recognizing. You go back to the paragraph we just read, that in your desperation you are willful and you need something to replace that, which is a need for power. And then it says here, it says, we get into this place where with whom we form a relationship with God. We form a relationship with God. This is a sort of a production. So we enter into this sort of negotiation with a desperation and a need, and we realize that the power is not a flimsy reed. It's a strong, powerful thing. And then we begin to ask in prayer and in meditation to do the bidding of this power. And then all of a sudden we form this relationship with this power that I have no doubt, when it tells us into step 11 in the book, it tells us we come to rely upon it. It's not something anymore that's rolling the dice. Oh boy, the shit's hitting the fan. I hope that I get out of this one. It's not about that anymore. It's that in front of the discovery or the difficulties we have, we know that there's this power. We've formed a relationship with this power. And again, it wants us to not have friction. And I don't know. I haven't spent a whole lot of time in the Bible Belt or anything like that, or certainly in our area, we don't have that friction. We have two ways. There's only two ways: those that already have a belief and an understanding and a power, and those that do not. That's the two things we have. And never does anybody come in here and talk about a religious God, or I have never seen conflict in my Alcoholics Anonymous life for 36 years about religiosity or about the nature of the God. Never. I have never seen that. So maybe I'm fortunate, maybe, but that's the area I'm in, right? So I just think, again, in its most simple terms, it's not about proving the existence of a God. It's about proving the need for a God. You're working with somebody. We're not spending any time talking. Even Ebby in the page 13 said to him, "What about that conversation we had?" And he said, "If there's something, I must have it." That was enough to make a beginning. We're told that in all of our second step work, we're told that all our mind has to do is become open. There's no friction with that. So that's what I got for that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I love that it says, if what we have learned and felt and seen means anything at all, it means that all of us, whatever race, creed, or color, are the children of a living creator. There's no grandchildren. There's no um, we're all a child of our creator, and however we choose to describe that. But like, that's encouraging. And the willingness and honesty is indispensable, and it keeps coming up. We have to have an open mind and being willing and honest. I mean, it's hard to be honest when you don't even really know what honesty, like when you first come into the program. It's like, am I really being completely honest? But it's not about perfection, but the willingness as an action, and the honesty to the best of our ability, and open to try to do something new, and to put what we were doing before to the side for a little bit, because it didn't really work for us. Like I swore when I came, I'm like, no, I don't need to read We Agnostics. Like, I've got God. That's no problem. Till I found out that, like, that was a lot of what was holding me up for a little bit. And when I put that aside, and I was able to have a new experience with the same God, that a new relationship, and that it wasn't so, I guess, legalistic would be a good word. So I don't know
Well,
if that makes sense, but
but back to the name of your meeting is like, the spiritual life is not a theory. The only place where protestations or argument or dissension comes from is when we argue about the theories of this God. We never, nobody, when you sit down and when I share some with anybody about my spiritual experience in that jail cell that day, no one ever tries to correct me.
Mhm.
They don't ever say, some people have said, "Oh, praise Jesus," and I don't know if it was Jesus. I don't know. I praise God. What I know is that in that moment, I was lifted to my feet by a power that was not known to me, and my life has been connected to that power ever since. So the only time we ever get into trouble is when we start getting theoretical about this stuff, and the spiritual life is not a theory; it's a practical application of this work, so that one day that power is available to you at all times, good and bad, and you recognize it. That's the other thing, is the beauty of this, again, this meeting, is you started off at the set aside prayer. So the 35 people that are out there, if maybe 10 of them struggle with this God and don't understand whether this God is rolling in their life or not, it's like, all you need to do when you come to a meeting like this is just set stuff aside. We'll hit a couple paragraphs here, and maybe something inside will just pry your mind open a little bit. We're not going to stick a God in there of our understanding. We're going to pry the mind open a little bit so that you don't stop whatever God of your understanding comes in. That's what we're really going for in AA.
That's a great way of explaining it. Awesome. Thank you. All right, moving on 28. We think it no concern of ours what religious bodies our members identify themselves with as individuals. This should be an entirely personal affair, which each one decides for himself in the light of past associations or his present choice. Not all of us join religious bodies, but most of us favor such memberships. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. What do you got, Marty?
Well, again, like having the fortune of spending this evening with you guys with 36 years of sobriety under my belt and a ton of experience, and we have a lot of we don't have a lot of clubhouses and stuff here in Canada. All of our Alcoholics Anonymous meetings are in church basements, or that's just the way it goes. And so I've met parishioners and priests and ministers and nuns through all of these years. I'm going to tell you something. Many of them cannot get sober, hooked devoutly and divinely to their religious bodies, hooked into they can pray like nobody else prays. And they know God. They know God like nobody else knows God. But there's this thing that the spiritual life is not a theory. It's a practical thing. So when it talks there about identifying themselves, in their own sort of religious body, it's like, that's okay. I have watched men and women get reconnected to the religion of their childhood. And just a real quick little story, Summer. I was probably about 4 or 5 years sober in the parish that I was grown up in, that I struggled a great deal with when I was in my years of hostility and angst. The Catholic Church was not my friend. There was an AA meeting in this church, and I walked in the doors, and you go right to the meeting. And I had been there a few times. Like, I had been to this meeting. It was a good little meeting. It was a Thursday night meeting, and I walked, and I would always turn right. Well, this particular night, for some strange reason, the smell. This is my childhood parish. The smell drew me left, and I moved into the parish. I moved into the church, and I looked up, and there was the crucifix that was there when I was a kid. And I looked up at Jesus on the cross and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't have a Christian epiphany. I began to feel the safety and the solitude of that environment. And I sat down in the back row of that church all by myself at 7 o'clock on a winter night, peaceful as all peace could be. And I began to hear the recitations of the scripture when I was a kid. I began to hear it. I heard the Lord's Prayer that I'd said at many AA meetings and thought it was one big long sentence. I heard it for the first time while I was sitting there, and I began to weep. And I knew that whoever was trying to inspire me spiritually back then was doing the best they could. I had a closed mind. I had a closed heart. I was filled with will. It's my self-will that blocks out the need for any other sort of direction. And I realized all of that sitting there. And I swear to God, from that point, I'm doing sweetgrass ceremonies, native ceremonies. I'm going to all kinds of religious endeavors. I had started to talk to a lot of people at AA who were living spiritual lives through religiosity, and I began to have this incredible. It was gifted. It was a gift from God that I had this incredible open mind around spiritual terms, spiritual matters, and seeing how, where it tells us later is we got to see where religious people are right. I started to see how religious people were right and in some of their things. Now, again, when I say the spiritual life is not a theory, that doesn't change for the square, John, any more than it does for us. Like there are a lot of people that talk religiosity out of one side of their mouth and live a completely different way. And if I have one fear, Summer, in recovery, in my recovery, is that I become that person that talks one way and acts another. The 10-step won't allow that to happen in practice. But if I sit back and rest on my laurels, that's why it says it in step 10, then I will begin to do that. I will begin to become spiritually pious and spiritually prejudiced. And what's the word? There's a word for it. I'll become spiritually unsober.
Callous, maybe like a callous, spiritually callous.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, if you guys only knew what I have, if I get into that attitude, oh my God. And sometimes that's what I mean. That's what I'm battling here sometimes. But this is not all of us join religious bodies, but we favor. Another very quick sort of story is that my group on a Thursday night would meet outside of this church basement door. And there's a great big full gospel church next door, about 200 meters, 200, I don't know what you guys say, 200 feet, say 400 feet away. And out comes the, one night we're all out there smoking and drinking coffee and probably talking about health. And a guy comes across the parking lot and his name's Frank. And he's the caretaker for the church. And he says, I've seen you guys out here for the last year, every Thursday night. What he's doing? When I told him, he knew nothing of AA. And he said, do you mind if I come in? And I asked a couple of guys, I said, you got a drinking problem? He says, I haven't had a drink in 3 years, but I had to stop. And then now I'm the caretaker of the church. It keeps me out of trouble. I said, why don't you come on in? Come on in and have a listen. At the end of the meeting, he says, can I bring the pastor over? I want him to hear you guys pray. And the pastor came over the next week and heard us do the Lord's Prayer at the end of the meeting. And he just tears started streaming down his face. And he said, if my parishioners could pray with the earnestness like you guys do, I don't think, he said, I'd be having any problems. So people lay witness to this thing that we have. When one alcoholic gets together with another alcoholic, that power is there. And I just wanted to throw that into there. That's our membership. When it says here, that's my membership. I go to any church I want. I'm not a membership of any church or dominant denomination, but I speak of God often, and I can go any church I want and participate wholly in a ceremony. I'm godfather to 6 children, in all of them, each in different faiths that I know nothing about. I know nothing about. Somebody thought it would be hip to have me as their godfather because I'm cool and I believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the only criteria. I knew nothing about what it is they're supposed to practice, but that's the demonstration of AA, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for those. That's awesome. See, I knew I would love having you here. You're awesome. All right. We're going to go right back to the book. In the following chapter, there appears an explanation of alcoholism as we understand it. Then a chapter addressed to the agnostic. Many who once were in this class are now among our members. Surprisingly enough, we find such convictions no great obstacle to a spiritual experience. Further on, clear-cut directions are given showing how we recovered. These are followed by 42 personal experiences. I think I'm going to just read it until the end. Each individual in the personal stories describes in his own language and from his own point of view the way he established his relationship with God. These give a fair cross section of our membership and a clear cut idea of what has actually happened in their lives. We hope no one will consider these self revealing accounts in bad taste. Our hope is that many alcoholic men and women desperately in need will see these pages, and we believe that it is only by fully disclosing ourselves and our problems that they will be persuaded to say, yes, I am one of them too. I must have this thing. All right, I'm gonna let you do this, Marty.
Wow. It's funny what happens when it's funny what happens when you roll out just a couple of paragraphs. So of course it's reminding us what we've just read. It's reminding us what we just read and then where we're going here. It's telling us what we're going to be experiencing. But then it says, you know, they're saying that so that people understand that we're going to remove any sort of obstacles that you might have, whatever the defiance that's inside of you that says, I don't need anything, I don't need another power, I've got this, I've got this. That's a saying. I hate that saying when somebody says, no, I got this, and that's what we have to bust through. And it says like, there's not going to be any great obstacle for a spiritual experience except that. It's like defiance is the only thing that will stop anybody from having a spiritual experience. It's the only thing. And so we get here, it says further on clear cut directions. Well, how many times have we used as big bookers? How many times have we used that term? You had Kevin Olson on here. Oh my God, clear cut directions, I think should be his middle name or something.
Yeah.
It's like, and it uses the term twice. It uses the term twice in 2 consecutive paragraphs when it talks about clear cut idea and clear cut directions. And what does that mean? Clear cut. Well, in Canada, I come from a land of trees, and a clear cut is a wide open field. That's what they call it, a clear cut. Clear cut directions. How do we get it that way? What directions are we going to take? I think that's a specific reference to the steps. I don't think there's to be any confusion there. And if you own a big book and you're sitting there tonight following through, just do what I did, highlight clear cut directions and put a line up in the margin that says steps. And if you don't want to destroy your big book, I don't know what to tell you. There's a saying: if a person's big book is all ratty and torn up and shredded, they probably aren't. And that's a pretty good saying. They're probably together. If your big book's all falling apart, you're probably together. But just clear cut directions are given showing how we recovered. And look at there again, they're referring to being recovered. We got specific directions on how we recovered. It's introducing us to the idea that this stuff we're talking about here right now, this resistance, this defiance, this is going to diminish. It's going to go away. You don't stay locked in your second or third week of sobriety saying, man, I love AA, I really like the fellowship, and you're damn right, I'm powerless over alcohol, but I cannot get my head around that God thing. Well, it's telling us right here is a clear-cut direction going to show how we recovered, and you're going to understand that you can be defiant all you want, right up until you're not. It's okay not to believe. You need to follow the directions. If you follow the clear-cut directions, belief is not the issue. When it says came to believe, they're talking about a process. When it says came to believe, they're talking about growing in an understanding. So you just can't say no. If you say no, which it tells us a little further on in second step stuff, then that means you need to try some more drinking. If you're going to approach Alcoholics Anonymous in a willful way, you know what? You need to try some more drinking, because I believe what you read right out of the hop is not that requisite desperation is not there. If it was there, because I meet a lot of guys who are very desperate in their first or second day in detox, but a couple nights sleep and a couple cheeseburgers, you try to tell them about the power, and all of a sudden, no, I got this, man. I'm okay. They're on the phone all day, calling everybody, telling them what they need and all that stuff. Desperation is very important. And now when it refers to our stories, is there anything else that we need to hear about? You can take each one of those stories in the back of the book, and some are much better than others and better written than others. I mean, we all know Bill edited them and put whatever he wanted in there and took out whatever he didn't want in there. We all know that. But each one at its root is talking about being powerless And then, which is the only issue in AA, you either are, you aren't, and then talk about accessing power. Every single story talks about that. And it's a story of our founder at the beginning. It's a story of our co-founder at the first story in the back. And Bob was a praying man, and we're not talking about religion here. This guy was on it. He was praying like a madman. He was praying when he was shit-faced. He was praying all the time that he could stop drinking, but there was no effective relationship with God. There was no effective relationship with God. And that had nothing to do with defiance. It had to do with self-will. It had to do with giving it over. And so what we're talking about here is getting this relationship with God. And look at the cross section. Look at the cross section that's involved in those stories. We have people that were on the skids. We have women. We have people that have been beaten up, and high level professionals. We have a clear cut idea of what actually happened in their lives because they took the time to share it with us. And I said it earlier, I'll say it again. When one alcoholic, for the purpose of recovery, shares with another alcoholic, for some strange reason, this power, this God, identifies itself. It shows itself, and when you'll hear, they used to send this book out to people, and this book didn't have these stories in it, but it had stories in it. And it would send the book out to people so that somebody reading it would go, just what it says at the bottom. Yeah, I'm one of the two. I got to have this thing. And there were a number of requests that came in. They talk about the hard start that Alcoholics Anonymous had and all that kind of stuff. But when that book was getting mailed out, they were getting requests. The books were being shared around towns and churches and doctors' offices, and they were getting requests because people were in trouble. People were in trouble. So, it's interesting too. It says that it's only by fully disclosing ourselves. And look at that term, fully. Have you ever bumped into an alcoholic at a major professional sports event or at a concert or in a grocery store when it's really busy? Have you ever bumped into some of your compadres out in public? If you do, something very interesting happens. See, it says here, we believe it's only by fully disclosing ourselves and our problems that they'll be persuaded. If you're out in those endeavors, you will find that you bump into somebody from your home group or something like that. You get very close together physically. That's the first thing that happens. You lean in. And then all of a sudden you start talking about real stuff. Real stuff. By fully disclosing ourselves, we start talking about real stuff. We take great risks here, and I don't know why. I got to tell you guys stuff tonight that I wouldn't tell anybody in my workplace that I've known for 15 years. But I'll give it to you guys. We fully disclose here because that's the power of spirit. That's the power of this inspiration that connects us. It's not just telling our stories. Like, you look at Ernie Kurtz's book, the Spirituality of Imperfection. It's all about our stories. Every bit of learning in our lives spiritually is about storytelling. Every aspect of it. Since the beginning of time, it doesn't matter what culture or what ethnicity or what religion, since the beginning of time, spirit is described through storytelling because you can't describe it any other way. You can't describe it without a biased definition, but you can describe it in a story. When I was in the jail cell that day and I was brought to my knees, that's how you describe it. And then somebody goes, oh my God, I thought I was crazy. I heard the voice of God too. I thought I heard a voice and I thought I was nuts, so I dismissed it. And all of a sudden they meet you and they meet me and they have this sort of revelation that maybe I can have this thing too. I must have this thing. How powerful is that? How powerful is that? And this is under the auspices of there is a solution. We're sneaking in or creeping in a little bit of stuff here about you suck at running your life. You're no good at it. I'm no good at it. And I need something. And they're sneaking this in here. And I'm not talking about trickery. I'm talking about subtlety. I'm talking about, okay, you've had your share of effort in this. You've done the best you could. How about we're gonna move towards something different? And it introduces that in the paragraph we were reading before when it says we're going to talk about more about alcoholism and all that stuff. That's where we're going with this. We're going to get a little more specific about what's wrong with you and a little more specific about what the solution is.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marty. I think you covered it completely and fully. And we're going to move on to chapter 3. More.
You jump in any time you want there. So
I know.
I'll get going. I won't stop, man.
You want to read the first paragraph on more about alcoholism?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks.
We're into some really meaty stuff here, so I don't sure how far you want to go, but how much time do we got?
We have 15 minutes left, and you don't have to read a full paragraph. You can just do a sentence. What I mean, we have 15
This
minutes, so
this is good stuff.
yeah.
Okay, more about alcoholism, chapter 3, page 30, for those that are following along. Most of us have been unwilling to admit that we were real alcoholics. No person likes to think he is bodily and mentally different from his fellows. Therefore, it's not surprising that our drinking careers have been characterized by countless vain attempts to prove we could drink like other people. The idea that somehow, someday, he will control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing, and many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. What do you got for me, son?
All right. Well, the second sentence where it says, "No person likes to think he is bodily and mentally different from his fellows," and I can see that now in my life, but I have kids, and it's just like when they don't have something that like everyone else has, it is devastating. Like they don't understand, like, why don't I have those shoes, or why does my hair look like this, or why am I short and they're tall, blah blah blah. No person likes to be different from like the mass, right? And I really, it was weird. Like for me, like I didn't want to be different, but then I had this like terminally, like I was different, but I don't want to be different than the mass, but I would have to be treated differently. And learning that the great obsession of every real alcoholic or abnormal drinker is that one day we're going to be able to control that drinking. One day I'll be able to just drink beer, or they'll come out with like this and that, and I'll be able to have cheese with beer or whatever, like just the silly things that would come up one day. And that obsession belongs to every abnormal drinker. And if that doesn't get smashed, it says right here, the persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Illusion, yeah. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. And I mean, that's some real stuff, because just because we think that maybe one day we'll be able to drink like the others, or take a pill or whatever it is. And like for me, it's not even always substances. It's like sometimes I think like maybe like the stuff that comes into my mind, I'm like, I don't know, like I have it with all areas of my life. It's not just with the substances, but it's like my mind plays tricks on me. I have like the liar that tells me things, and like it just, the delusion of my mind. Yeah, that's all I have really.
Well, I know that I hope that what this meeting does invite is people who are wondering, or people who are entering into, or just enjoying, or learning about this book. I think one of the key features, which again makes us understand how different we are from other people, is that when it's talking about our drinking, it's about that somehow, someday, we will control and enjoy. It doesn't say control our drinking, or it doesn't say enjoy our drinking. It says control and enjoy. If I tried to control my drinking, I didn't enjoy it. And if I enjoyed my drinking, it was out of control. And that's what makes me alcoholic. There's another key feature there of my alcoholism. So anytime that I had to set limits or anything like that, I was completely disturbed. And in trying to control it was an exercise in futility. It was awful. I can't think of anything more painful. I've gone through a ton of devastating circumstances in my sober life, but I can't think of anything more painful than having a drink and a half. You know what I mean? Or trying to stop. When my mother or my loved one or whatever would beg me and say, "Please, just don't go there tonight, please," and then say, "Hey, no, I got this. Stop it too." And that is a painful, painful undertaking, because I'm going to move into debauchery and lying and deceit, because I can't control it. And to enjoy it, it has to be out of hand. I'll only enjoy drinking if have you guys, just a lot of people I hear the story is that they went to someone, offered them a drink, and they basically knew themselves well enough to say, "Well, how much you got?" And they say, "Well, there's only one." No, I won't bother. It's because I'm not going to enjoy one. I'm not going to enjoy social drinking. That's not going to happen. I'll only enjoy it if it's crazy and out of hand. Now, this whole thing about the pursuit,
Mhm.
I wish on people that they can understand that when they're talking about gates, they're talking about your mind.
Mm.
They're talking about your mind. You die. You go insane, and or you die in your mind. And the way I know that, and I don't know if you swear on here or anything like that, but most people when they're desperate and they want to kill themselves and everything, when they're all messed up, the last two words you'll hear from anybody that goes out on a terrible relapse is that the last two words that went through their head were "fuck it." And that's the shutting of the gates. That's the mind is the gates are shut, and I am going to live in that insanity and in that spiritual death. And in my darkness, on July the 15th, 87, and back in my darkness, that's where I was. I was in a jail cell, but some of you weren't, but you were exactly where I was. You were exactly where I was, controlled, trapped, uh, uh, dominated by the prison of selfishness and self will, and dominated by that. And that's sober. Now, when I get smashed and I get all screwed up and stuff like that, some of that, the angst of that pain and that of being insane and dying goes away, but it never stays there. So again, I always hearken people back to that moment where they just reached out for help, just before they reached out for help. Don't lose sight of that. And it says into the gates. It doesn't say to the gates. It says into the gates. I've listened to people read that wrong and caught it because I think that that word into is so important. Into the gates of insanity and death. That's all of us. We pursue this to that level. And they're not talking about hospitals and prisons and a casket. They're talking about that death that we suffer inside from isolation, separation. That's what they're talking about.
Mhm. Thank
And
you.
that's the sort of that's the preface in my estimation, anyways, and in my book. Like my book is all chopped up and it's doing what it's supposed to do. And in my book, that's the preface right before our introduction to the first step of Alcoholics Anonymous. Without any confusion, you know, you hear people say you took the first step getting here and all that horse stuff. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this. This is prefacing the first step.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. We learned, and back on page 30, we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we are like other people, or presently maybe, has to be smashed. Go ahead, Marty.
Oh my god.
No,
It's I think if you had to isolate, and I don't like to do this, and it always changes over time, but if I had to isolate single paragraphs that are most powerful and informative, it's this. This, I believe, is step one of Alcoholics Anonymous. When it says we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable, that's the on the wall step. And I saw that for the first 14 years I was in sobriety, and I had never seen this. And this full concession this full concession here to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic. What does it mean to be alcoholic? Well, we've just read like 30 pages of information about what it means to be alcoholic. And so this is the first step in recovery. We have to concede that this is us. When I read Bill's story and I look at the doctor's opinion and I look at there's a solution, and I say to myself, when it says that I must have this thing, is we have to fully concede to our innermost selves. No one else can see that happening. I have some ideas about, you know, kind of what it looks like. You know, the guy who wants the mop, the guy who's there early to set up the chairs, the guy who stays late to pick up the butts in the parking lot. I have an idea about what it can look like when a person's desperation is there and that they've made it. But that doesn't always see or include a full concession. And it's very important for you to define these words. It's very important for you to understand and look at your giving up, because we're using a word here. We're inferring a word here that is probably one of the most powerful terms that you will ever come up against in recovery, and that's surrender. We have to surrender to this. This is the first step in recovery. This delusion that we're like other people, or presently might be, has to be smashed. I'm going to be honest with you. That part of it, I never compared myself to anybody else. I remember sitting there waiting for a bar to open up at like 10 to 11 in the morning with a couple other guy hobos beside me. And I'm 17 years old, and these guys were old street guys who I'd known for years from the community I was in. And all three of us, well, there's four of us all together, were staring into the glass waiting for the bar to open up. And I didn't think there was anything wrong with that. I didn't think I was like other people. I didn't want to be like other people. This delusion that I'm drinking like other people was obvious. That I wasn't drinking like other people was obvious to me. I was in courts and I had family members and everybody telling me there was a problem with my drinking. Now, this is written, I think, by an individual who pulled it off for a little while, who got through some stuff and made a life for themselves. I was robbed of it early and knew that this was a big problem. There was no delusion that I was like other people. My delusion was, I had a delusion, but it was very focused on that, like I said earlier, somehow, someday I'm going to beat this thing. That one day it's not going to cause all the trouble it's going to cause. That was my delusion, is that if just this happened or that happened. It wasn't like other people. I didn't think I was like other people. But I think that little paragraph that you just read, Summer, I think is one of the most profound, powerful commentaries in our book. And I think it's pretty specific. We have to fully concede that clear-cut direction. I think so. And it says that this delusion has to be smashed. I think that's pretty straight up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that we have to fully concede to our innermost selves. Like,
Yeah.
this is what's, our innermost self. That's where we're going to find our, our higher powers within. And like, we have an internal problem. So we have to have an internal solution, like can't keep trying to grab at things that are on the outside, of us. And concede, I looked it up and I thought that was interesting. Like what it said really quick. Sorry, I have my wrong glasses on, so that's why I'm like going. It's to show, although often against one's will, that one agrees to or with something. I thought that was interesting because it puts in like, although it might be against your will, you still are agreeing to it.
Yeah.
So it's not just like, yay, I'm going to concede, but it's like that, against our will.
Yeah, I don't like it.
I don't like it. Yeah, exactly. All right. I'm gonna do one more. We alcoholics are men and women who have lost the ability to control our drinking. We know that no real alcoholic ever recovers control. All of us felt at times that we were regaining control, but such intervals, usually brief, were inevitably followed by still less control, which led in time to pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. We are convinced to a man that alcoholics of our type are in the grip of a progressive illness. Over any considerable period, we get worse, never better. And that's true even when we're not drinking. Like, it's a progressive fatal illness. We don't have to be drinking the substance for it to be getting worse. And then, once you pick up again or just whatever it is, it's going to be right back or worse. But I'd like to hear what you have to say about the incomprehensible demoralization. And yeah, I'd like to hear that, Marty.
Well, yeah, and I mean, again, the power. Like, we're into more about alcoholism and the power of the identification of our drinking and our drinking lives. It's so remarkable that Bill and anybody else who contributed to this writing had such a clear understanding of the torment that goes on inside a person who cannot not drink. Like we're in this place right now where we're talking about, I'm going to drink no matter what. Like, it's not about whether I swear off. Like, that's why the second time it's referred to as real alcoholic. The second time we're referring to a real alcoholic. Well, what about the real alcoholic? Well, the real alcoholic doesn't have a drinking problem. He has a drinking solution. The real alcoholic is the person that we're talking about here, that he never, ever is going to regain control. Then it goes into this place where it's inevitably followed by still less control, which led in time to pitiful and comprehensible demoralization. I know what Bill was talking about there is that he woke up in places and he did things that he was absolutely tormented and ashamed about. Well, oh my God, this is what we're talking about. This is what we're really talking about here. And your circumstances are going to be different than mine, and mine were different than Bill's. But some of you don't know how many jail cells I woke up in and had no idea what I was doing there. And the demoralization is I was laying in puke, or I was laying in shit, and my head was in a steel toilet and puking again and sick, and having to ask the coppers what I did, what happened. This happened over and over and over again. And coming out of the custody and seeing in the newspaper the next day and this incomprehensible demoralization about what I did to my family again. And this tearing this thing down and looking at people through the glass with the phone and in custody and promising them I'll never do it again. This pitiful and incomprehensible. See, that's this incomprehensible demoralization is I don't understand it and nobody else can understand it. Everybody's looking, what's wrong with you? I saw a birthday cake Chris Schroeder got there from his family there a couple of years ago, and that's what it said on. What's wrong with you? And this is what they would always ask, what's wrong with you? And it's like, I didn't know. I didn't know. It's incomprehensible to me. It's incomprehensible to me. I set out on my day to do something very different than the way the day ends up. I am powerless. It happens over and over and over again. I'm woke up with shame and guilt and remorse. Now, I'm going to tell you something. This is a little bit of a sidebar issue, is you can only do that for so long, and one of two things happen. You need to put a gun in your mouth, a rope around your neck, or you need to jump off a building somewhere, or you need spiritual help. Now, I'm not going to go on my own for spiritual help. So what do? I shut down, and at 19 years old, I'm diagnosed sociopathic. I do not play well with others. I'm not making anybody any more promises. This is my life, and this is the way it's going. I spend my young adolescence and adulthood in prison. And that's directly on the heels of this pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. Not the pity and the demoralization, the incomprehensibility of it. I can't understand it. I don't know why it keeps happening. This thing when Bill says at the bar and he ordered, after telling the bartender his whole story, and then he orders a couple drinks, and the bartender goes, "What are you, nuts?" And he says, "I guess so." Bill could talk about what was happening and never understand what was happening. And I was the same way. That's what we're talking about here. And it's pitiful. It's pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization. And that lack of understanding is what kept that cycle going. Convinced to a man in alcohol type in a grip of progressive illness. We refer, not one place in our literature, in our big book, does it refer to alcoholism as a disease. Nowhere. But we do. We say it all the time. Alcoholism is an illness. It's an illness. And it says right there, it says, over considerable time, we get worse. We never get better. So this is with or without treatment. Over a considerable amount of time, we get worse, never better. So you accept the treatment and stay on course. We're not talking about better. We're talking about all the problems that existed in your past. All the problems as you know them evaporate. They go away. We don't get, quote unquote, better. We surrender, and new ideas and conceptions flood into us. We begin to live a different way, and we're not sometimes even conscious of it. We're acting in ways that go completely against what people have described as our nature, when in fact our nature was actually to be loving, caring, and sensitive. We destroyed that through our alcohol use. But now all of a sudden, we're starting to live a life that on the outside certainly looks much improved, and on the inside, we're just doing what it is we're directed to do. Clear-cut directions. Very powerful. Very powerful. And only the surrendered, only the desperate will do this. If you're in Alcoholics Anonymous for a little while and you're still suffering and you're still in pain and all that kind of stuff, you're not drinking, you're not drugging, I challenge you on your surrender. You don't have to live like this anymore. When I screamed out in that cell, that's what I screamed out. I don't want to live like this. I don't want to live like this anymore. And I heard a voice say, you don't have to. You don't have to live like this anymore. And I haven't. 14 years, I lived a life of willfulness. Hang on a second. I lived a life of willfulness for 14 years. Mark Houston took me through the steps in a hotel room, and my life changed at 14 years sober. And from that time to this, I've been so ingrained in understanding and practically applying the principles here and the clear cut directions in my life, that's the message I now share. Just quickly referring Summer back to what we were talking about when we're talking about religionists and all that kind of stuff. I know lots of born again Christians and stuff like that who've had powerful experiences spiritually, but you can't transmit that message in AA. That's not a message you can transmit. You know, when I had that powerful spiritual experience in the jail cell that day where I heard the voice of God, I can't transmit that message. I tried, but I can't. You know, Marty Mann had the same experience. Bill Wilson had the bright light experience. That wasn't the message Sam Shoemaker said that these alcoholics need to hear. They need to hear about your drinking. And when you go through the 12 steps with somebody, when you take somebody through this, that's the message. Having had a spiritual experience as a result of these steps, we carry this message. That's the spiritual message. It's not the message of a God. It's the message of the 12 steps and the discovery of what they can do for you. You know? So I get pretty riled up with this stuff. I like this stuff.
Yeah. I wish we could go on forever, but it's a little bit after 9, so we're gonna stop right here. Thank you so much for being here with me, Marty, and thank you for all your insight and just wonderful. I learned so much. So thank you for being here, and I'm gonna turn off the recording and then open up for questions and answers and any comments or anything. So
Thanks for
okay. And